As someone who used the Genesis for more than half of this year, the Waves is a pretty big letdown. This was the least enjoyable paddle I have reviewed in well over a year, and I haven't been more frustrated or agitated while reviewing a paddle in a long time. There's a lot to unpack, so let's get into it. The Carbon Waves officially launches September 25th and is going to retail for $279.99, just like the original Genesis did. If you plan to pick one up or find this review helpful, you can use discount code PBStudio to save 10% on your order. The Waves is going to come in all four shapes that Carbon offers. The 1 is their elongated long handle shape, the 2 is a wide body, the 3 is a short handle elongated, and the 4 is the recent addition of their hybrid shape. They've also added an NFC chip similar to Yola for authenticity verification. You don't need to use it to register your paddle for warranty, but you are able to hold your phone up to it to verify that it's a genuine Waves paddle if you're buying it from someone else. Now, you might be wondering what changed with the Waves from the Genesis. And the primary change from the Genesis is going to be the new core cutout design. If you look at the X-ray, you'll see why the paddle is named Waves. There are all these wave line cutouts throughout the paddle. These were supposed to be designed in a way to maximize dwell time and the amount of power that it can generate. Carbon also took feedback from the Genesis, and instead of doing a small fiberglass patch in the sweet spot, they now have a fiberglass sheet that goes through the entire paddle. There are 5 layers of material, 2 carbon fiber layers on the bottom, fiberglass in the middle, and 2 more carbon fiber layers on top of that. As far as the playability specs go, you can see those on screen now. The main thing to take note of is that the elongated models have lower swing weights than when the Genesis launched and are in very reasonable ranges of 118 and 119. But overall, these are more or less the same as the prior Genesis models in terms of how the specs came out, and there aren't any big surprises here to be aware of. Now, I'm going to split this review into 2 types of sections. First, I'm going to give you guys the more objective thoughts about this paddle, and then I'm going to give you my opinion and experience after playtesting it for nearly the last 2 weeks. This is so that you can have a clear picture of this paddle from a more objective standpoint as well as my own opinion. Also, as far as the paddles playtested, I primarily used the 1, 2, and 4 shapes and didn't find that there was a significant benefit or difference between each of the shapes outside of the things that you would normally expect, like the wide body being faster in the hand and the elongated hitting harder. So first, the Waves is advertised as one of the most legally powerful paddles allowed in pickleball by Carbon, because it nearly maxes out the PB Core test from USAP. But with that being said, I think many people will find that out of the box, the Waves is not a significant upgrade in power over the Genesis. But a lot of that is going to be due to perception of the feel and sound, and not necessarily the actual power of the paddle. The Waves has a softer and more muted feel off the face than most of the power paddles on the market right now. As foam has gone on throughout the year, we've started to see more companies create full foam core paddles that are closer in feel to a polymer Gen 3 style paddle. They're stiffer and louder and have more immediate pop off the face. Think paddles like the Rhombus Quanta, the Bread and Butter Loco, and then the Selkirk Boomstick. So if you're used to some of those paddles or the Gen 3 style power paddles, then Waves may give you the perception that it's less powerful because it isn't as loud and the feel is not as stiff as those other paddles. Sound and feel often play a very large role in people's perception of how powerful a paddle is, and people aren't usually aware of that. In fact, my first few sessions with the Waves, I was under the impression that it really wasn't that powerful. But when we put a radar gun on it, serve speeds were around 57 miles per hour for the Waves versus the 55 miles per hour on the original Genesis. And this would be roughly the gap that I would expect from the all-cord style paddle that the Genesis is compared to a power paddle. For reference, drive speeds on my wide body boomstick were just barely higher at 57.6 miles per hour, and the Rhombus Quanta with 15 grams of weight was 58.3 miles per hour. So objectively looking at the numbers, Waves can hit shots such as drives, serves, and putaways roughly as fast as some of the other top performing power paddles, even if the perception doesn't feel like it. Pop is where the Waves is more toned down compared to the current competition. Many of the competitors are trying to max out both pop and power, but that isn't necessarily better for all types of players. In fact, I think for a lot of people out there, having a paddle that isn't as poppy is actually a good thing. High amounts of pop is what usually gets players into trouble when they don't have great control of their soft game. So by having a paddle that feels softer at ball contact and isn't as poppy as the top paddles, this might make it easier to control in comparison to the other top power paddles right now. A paddle that the Waves reminded me of was the Honolulu J2 FC Plus. Not because I think they're the same paddle, but just that they have a similar power and pop profile. The FC Plus can actually drive the ball pretty hard, but the pop isn't as aggressive as the ability to drive the ball. If I had to make a more direct comparison, I do think that the Waves is a smidge higher in both pop and power than the J2 FC Plus. As someone who used the Genesis for roughly 6 to 7 months this year, it's clear that the Waves is an upgrade in pop and power from the Genesis, but it took a lot of testing and hitting side by side to really pick up on it. When I first got the Waves, I really didn't think it was that big of an upgrade over the Genesis in terms of pop and power. So it isn't going to be like some of the other power paddles that have been coming out recently, where you pick it up and you can immediately feel the difference from a prior model or compared to some of the other competitors. So just know that if you pick one up, it may not necessarily feel like a giant upgrade from the Genesis right away. But now we're going to talk about the main reason that's going to make Waves such a hard recommendation in today's market. And that is the sweet spot. This is easily the biggest issue with the paddle, and I think the combination of a poor sweet spot and large price tag is going to make it a very hard sell for a lot of people in today's paddle market. If you've followed this channel for the last year, you'll know that I've said repeatedly that while the Paddle Techs are great performing paddles, the sweet spot holds them back from being truly great in today's market, and that's what's starting to make them fall down the list. That's exactly how I feel about the Waves. But to me, the drop-off in performance outside the sweet spot is more severe. I took the Waves to so many drill sessions to try and get this figured out, and for a minute, I thought maybe it was just me that was the problem. That maybe I was going through a phase of just being off, but as soon as I would compare it next to other competitive foam or polymer paddles, the issue would immediately go away. Even after playing the PaddleTech Bantam GTOC 12.7mm and the Waves side by side, I found that the sweet spot drop-off was less jarring on the PaddleTech, and that's coming from someone who has found it harder and harder to want to recommend or use a PaddleTech with the latest paddles available. One of the words I found myself consistently using while testing the Waves was flimsy. It just doesn't feel that solid. It reminds me a lot of how Gen 1 paddles are, which kind of makes sense. The Waves is constructed in more of a Gen 1 style. But just anytime I would miss on the sides, it just felt like the paddle was flexing, and it just wasn't a very pleasant feel to me. And when I look at the X-ray, it makes me wonder if that bigger wave at the edges is causing some of the stability issue, because anytime I hit near there, that is an area that feels very problematic to me and feels like it's flexing more than it needs to. So even if this paddle can generate great spin, good power, or reset slightly better with less pop than the other competitors, to me, all of that is completely negated by the fact that as soon as you miss outside the sweet spot, the performance drop-off is very steep. In fact, I even took one of my Carbon 2 Genesis models and took all of my weight off to compare to the Waves. And even though the Genesis has a fiberglass patch that some people find make the sweet spot inconsistent, I personally found that the Genesis was much more consistent across the face when compared to Waves, which makes me wonder if the issue is just the design of the core. Because in theory, the Genesis having a fiberglass patch in the center for extra power should be much less consistent than the Waves, which uses a fiberglass sheet through the whole face. That's the only thing that I can think would contribute to the sharp drop-off in performance outside of the center versus the Genesis. Now, this was all in stock form, so I thought maybe weight would help the paddle just like it did the Genesis. Because if you recall, I wasn't a huge fan of that paddle until I found the right weight setup. So I tried a bunch of different weight setups on the various shapes. First, I started with the 2 shape and did the same setup that I really liked on my Genesis, which was using 0.5 gram tungsten tape and covering the entire edges of the paddle. While this improved the paddle moderately, the sweet spot didn't improve nearly as much as I hoped. So I thought, let's be more aggressive with it. Recently, mimicking the same 15 grams of weight like how Selkirk did on the Project Boomstick has been successful with several other paddles. So I thought, okay, maybe the Waves is one of those paddles that needs a ton of weight. And nope, that still didn't work either. The drop-off in performance, even with that much weight at 3 and 9, was still way more severe than I felt it should be. I tried various other setups like putting 10 grams on the throat, then 10 grams near the head, followed by a 3 gram pod directly at the head, and the only one that made a decent difference was 10 grams on the side and then 3 grams at the head. This made the paddle feel a little less dead and gave slightly more margin when missing off center. Instead of a ball completely dying off the face, now it felt like it could at least have a chance of getting back over the net, but it was still a very lackluster improvement for how much weight and swing weight was added. The Carbon 1 with 10 grams on the side and 3 grams on the head went up to a 128 swing weight. The Carbon 4 with 10 grams placed slightly higher up and 3 grams at the head jumped to 123, and the Carbon 2 with my half-gram tungsten setup and a 3-gram pod at the head was 119. If you take the 3 grams off the head of each of those setups, all of them dropped by 4 points in swing weight. So even if that setup made the paddle decent, it wasn't good enough for me to think that I could recommend the Waves over many of the other options on the market, especially with a number of them being considerably cheaper than the Waves. Not to mention that the Waves isn't exactly light out of the box, so you don't necessarily have the same margin to add weight for improvement that you do on other paddles. While paddles like the Rhombus Quanta kinda suck out of the box, at least you can unlock the performance with weight. On the Waves, you're both limited in how much weight you can add, and it feels like weight doesn't make nearly as large of a difference on that construction type for a paddle. And who knows, maybe it's a me problem. Maybe I just suck and I can't hit the sweet spot consistently enough. But I've used nearly every relevant paddle on the market in the last year, and the vast majority of them have awesome sweet spots where you really don't need to worry that much about it. So I'm less inclined to give a paddle slack when most of the market doesn't have this issue. If you're coming from a paddle that has a smaller sweet spot already, like a Selkirk Power Air, the Carbon Genesis, a Paddletech Bantam, Rhombus Ripple V2, or Body Helix Flick F1, then these issues might not be as noticeable to you because you're already well adjusted to paddles that aren't as forgiving when you miss. But if you're used to paddles that have a great sweet spot, then the Waves is going to feel like a pretty big downgrade in that department. So with that being said, now let's get into the next topic, which is control. I think this paddle actually had a lot of potential to have great driving power, but still retain good control if it wasn't for the fact that the sweet spot is so limiting. Because of this, I did find that my resets when I was playing well felt pretty good on the Waves. However, as soon as I started being slightly off or my opponent was making me scramble, this is where the inconsistency in my ability to control the paddle came in. Sometimes I would hit a block and it would sail the ball way long. Other times it would drop straight into the ground. Sometimes I'd go to hit a counter and it was pretty fast. Other times it went nowhere. It constantly felt like rolling the dice to see what type of shot I would get from the paddle. The inconsistency just did not make me feel confident in my ability to control the paddle or manipulate the ball the way that I want. And this was across all types of shots, from dinks, drops, blocks, or resets. So even though this doesn't necessarily have the most pop or power on the market, I personally found it harder to control than paddles with more pop and power like the Selkirk Boomstick or Bread and Butter Loco. Whether or not it is the same story for you will depend on your skill sets and what you expect from a paddle. Maybe a lot of pop makes it really hard for you to use certain paddles, but you're very consistent at hitting the center, and sweet spot performance isn't as much of a factor for you. But for me, high pop isn't necessarily an issue if the sweet spot has good consistency. Now, I know there are people out there who love having their paddle make it very clear to them when they mishit the ball. So if you're one of those people, the Waves will give you that feedback. But for me, I'm not a fan of that at all. As for spin, I felt it was about the same as the Genesis. I think most people who pick one up will find that it gets better spin than their current paddle, but most of that is going to be due to them coming from a very worn out paddle, and anything fresh is always going to feel like an upgrade in comparison. So all of that is to say, spin is going to be good on the Waves, just like it was on the Genesis, but I wouldn't say it was an upgrade. Carbon is really trying to emphasize that this gets crazy dwell time, and while it might get more than the Genesis, I don't know that I would say it feels like it has drastically more than any other paddles on the market that have been advertised to have good dwell time. Particularly if you're comparing it to something like the Gearbox GX2, where you can literally see video clips of the ball sinking into the back of the paddle when a drive is hit. So to me, both spin and dwell time didn't necessarily feel like it was a whole lot better than some of the other competitors on the market. Now that we've talked about the performance attributes of the paddle, let's go over some of the attributes of the Waves that I think will be appealing to people. The first is that these are very likely to be durable. The Genesis had one of the better track records in 2025, and I have to imagine that Carbon put the same amount of attention and care into the Waves. In a time where a lot of paddles have bad quality control issues, I do think this is a really big benefit, and I want to give Carbon credit here, because I think companies building solid paddles often isn't talked about enough. Now, I am having to make an assumption here since the paddle hasn't been out long enough to really know, but it would be a gigantic miss from Carbon if this suddenly had huge issues that the Genesis never did, especially when they're constructed similarly, just with different cutouts in the core. Second, Carbon has a 30-day risk-free trial. So regardless of what I say about the paddle, the best part is you can literally try it for yourself without any risk. Carbon even pays the return shipping for the paddle. And if you are interested in the waves prior to this review, then I'd recommend you just try it and find out for yourself. Reviews should always be used as a guide to see if a paddle is in the realm of what you want, and they shouldn't be treated as pure gospel. I can present you with my experience, but you might have totally different preferences and find that the paddle is perfect for you. So just know that Carbon makes it very easy to demo this paddle. And the third and final thing, which goes along with the durability, is that Carbon does offer a 1-year warranty on their paddle. Okay, now that I've given you guys the facts about what you can expect from the paddle, I'm gonna give you my experience. And the reason I wanted to separate these two is because my experience with the waves was so negative that I wanted you to be able to hear the objective traits of the paddle and my experience as separate as possible. Because I do think that there will be people who enjoy the waves, but I'm definitely not one of them. I've not been more frustrated reviewing a paddle than I have the waves in a really long time. The only other paddle that would have been equally as frustrating had it received a full review this year would have been the new Adidas Metalbone variants. There was not a single time in my testing of this paddle where I enjoyed it. Every drill session that I had to sit through with the waves was like pulling teeth. The sweet spot felt so limiting for me that I just felt like I was drilling with a trainer paddle the entire time. And for me, the more muted feel alongside the poor sweet spot just never allowed the paddle to feel very satisfying, even if I was hitting center. Every single time I use this, people just heard me complain about it, and I very, very rarely complain about any paddle while I'm testing it. Because for the most part, everything new that has come out has followed a very similar formula that has been known to work really well for performance. In fact, it's been a minute since I've really had to give a paddle a negative review because everything this year has been good for the most part. Every time I went out to compare it to other paddles like the Bread and Butter Loco, the Boomstick, the Rhombus Quanta, the Vatic Pro V-Sol, or the Paddletech Bantam 12.7 millimeters, or really any other paddle that has gotten a half-decent review, it was like a massive breath of fresh air. And even when I took my unweighted Carbon Genesis, which if you recall, I didn't love that paddle without weight, I would so much rather play the Genesis with no weight than have to play the waves. To me, the face on the Genesis is more consistent, and while the power might not be as big on the Genesis, I would take that trade-off all day long to not have to deal with the tiny sweet spot. Like I said earlier, maybe I'm just not good enough to use the waves, but my question is, with so many paddles on the market that have equal or better performance for the same price, or even some for considerably less, why would you pick the waves? The amount of people that I think would truly love the waves over the rest of the paddles on the market is very small. So to wrap this review up, I'm really disappointed that the waves wasn't better. I think it's just the classic case of too little too late. While Carbon may have started this foam revolution for the market, I think the rest of the market has learned how to make a really good full foam paddle, and this iteration of the True Foam technology just doesn't compete with what's coming out now. There are very few of you out there who I can recommend the waves to. If you're a diehard Carbon fan and not a single paddle has been interesting to you except for the Genesis, but you wanted more power, then the Waves is going to be the paddle that will give you that experience. The Waves is best suited for players who can consistently hit the sweet spot, enjoy a softer, more muted feel at ball contact compared to other power paddles, want more power on drives, but not over-the-top pop, and who don't mind spending $280. But if you don't fall into that very narrow bucket of only enjoying the Genesis, I think there are so many more options that I could recommend, and the majority of them are cheaper than the Carbon. Just to name a few that I think outperformed the Waves, you have the Selkirk Boomstick, Sypic Avatar, Yola Pro 4s, Paddletech Bantams, Bread and Butter Loco, Honolulu J2 FC Plus and J2 NF, the 11624 Alpha Pro Power, Rhombus Quanta, and the Vatic Pro V-Sol Power or Pro. So in my opinion, the Carbon Waves is a hard pass, particularly at a price point of $280. I don't think it does much of anything better than the current competition, and the only real reason to consider it would be if you're a huge Carbon Genesis fan. But like I said earlier, don't just take my word for it. Try it yourself and use that 30-day risk-free trial to see what you think. A lot of companies don't offer this same 30-day trial, so it should be easy enough for you to see it firsthand and decide for yourself what you think. But anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.